December 12, 1943, Münster, Germany. The Boeing B-17F sits in a frozen field near the Dutch border, smoke still rising from its No. 3 engine. Its fuselage bears the scars of cannon fire, jagged holes punched through aluminum skin, the plexiglass nose shattered, blood frozen on the bombardier's station. But the aircraft is remarkably whole. Landing gear down, wings intact. 4 Wright Cyclone engines that could possibly turn again. Oberst Joseph Priller stares at the bomber and sees something different than wreckage. He sees opportunity. The Luftwaffe has shot down hundreds of B-17s over the past year. They've pulled apart the mangled remains, studied the wreckage, measured the armor plating around crew positions, analyzed the defensive gun positions. But they've never had one like this. Never had a flying fortress they could actually fly. Never had the chance to climb into the cockpit, feel the controls, understand the machine from the inside. Every tactical advantage they've theorized about, optimal attack angles, blind spots in the defensive armament, structural weak points, could now be tested in the air. The bomber had been part of the 91st Bomb Group, attacking Luftwaffe airfields in northern Germany. Flak had crippled the aircraft over the target, killing the pilot and wounding half the crew. The co-pilot, 23-year-old Lieutenant Harold Fischer, had no choice. He could bail out and let the fortress cartwheel into a German town, or he could try to bring her down. He chose the latter. Gear down, flaps down. A dead stick landing in a field that should have torn the aircraft apart, but somehow didn't. Fischer and his surviving crew were marched away to prisoner-of-war camps within hours. The B-17 stayed behind. Within 2 days, Luftwaffe recovery teams descended on the site. They didn't dismantle it. They repaired it, patched the holes, replaced the shattered nose section, drained the fuel system, and refilled it with German aviation gasoline. Mechanics who'd spent years destroying American bombers now worked to resurrect one. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. By December 20th, the bomber was airworthy. The Luftwaffe had been capturing Allied aircraft since the beginning of the war. Spitfires, Hurricanes, P-38 Lightnings, anything that landed or crashed relatively intact became part of a secret evaluation program. The unit responsible was Circus Rosarius, named after its first commander, Theodor Rosarius. Later, when command transferred to Oberst Werner Baumbach, it became Circus Regensburg, based at the Luftwaffe test facility near that Bavarian city. The mission was simple: fly enemy aircraft, understand their capabilities, exploit their weaknesses. But the B-17 was different. It wasn't a fighter. It was a strategic bomber. The aircraft that had been hammering German industrial targets for over a year, the machine that flew in formations of hundreds, protected by layers of 50-caliber machine guns that turned the sky into a crossfire killing zone. The B-17 had become a symbol. To the Americans, it represented precision bombing and the power of daylight raids. To the Germans, it represented an existential threat. Every day, more fortresses appeared over the Reich. Every day, German fighters fell trying to stop them. Now, the Luftwaffe had one. The initial test flights were cautious. German pilots who'd flown heavy bombers, men experienced with Heinkel, He-110 and Junkers Ju-88s, climbed into the cramped cockpit and took the controls. The B-17 handled differently than German bombers, heavier, less responsive, but stable, remarkably stable. The pilots noted the visibility from the cockpit, the layout of instruments, the way the aircraft responded to turbulence and battle damage. They flew mock defensive patterns, positioning Bf-109 fighters at various angles to identify blind spots in the gun coverage. They found them. The B-17's defensive armament looked impressive on paper, 50 caliber, Browning machine guns covering every approach angle. But in practice there were gaps. Directly below the nose, the bombardier couldn't depress his gun low enough. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high were difficult for the top turret gunner to track, and most critically, the area directly beneath the aircraft, the belly, was a vulnerability. The ball turret could rotate, but its range of motion was limited. A fighter approaching from 6 o'clock low, climbing into a firing position at a steep angle, could rake the fortress with cannon fire before the gunners could respond. Luftwaffe pilots had suspected this. Now they had proof. But someone in the German high command wanted more than technical data. They wanted theater. The idea emerged in late December during a staff meeting at Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin. The war was not going well. The Eastern Front had collapsed at Stalingrad. Allied bombers were destroying German cities. The Wehrmacht was retreating in the Mediterranean. Morale, at both military and civilian, was fraying. The German people needed a demonstration of strength, a reminder that the Luftwaffe still controlled the skies over the Reich. What better way to prove it than flying a captured American bomber over Berlin in broad daylight? The proposal was audacious. Fly the B-17 from Rechlin, the Luftwaffe test facility north of Berlin, directly over the capital. Let the citizens see an enemy bomber flying impotent and captured above their heads. Let the flak crews and fighter squadrons see it too. Show them that the seemingly invincible flying fortress was just another airplane, one that could be taken, flown, and paraded like a trophy. No one at that meeting considered what would happen when German gunners saw a B-17 in their airspace. No one thought about the instinct, drilled into every flak crew and fighter pilot over hundreds of missions, to fire on sight at any four-engine bomber with American markings. No one calculated the risk. They saw only the spectacle, and that miscalculation would turn 30 minutes over Berlin into chaos. The Luftwaffe's captured aircraft program didn't begin with propaganda stunts. It began with survival. By 1943, German fighter pilots were dying at rates that shocked even the most hardened commanders. The attrition wasn't just from combat, it was from ignorance. Pilots attacked Allied bombers using tactics developed against earlier, lighter aircraft. They approached from angles that exposed them to concentrated defensive fire. They aimed at sections of the fuselage that could absorb punishment. They underestimated the speed, the durability, the coordinated firepower of formations flying in tight defensive boxes, and they paid for it. Werner Baumbach understood this. A veteran bomber pilot himself, he'd been appointed to command the Luftwaffe's evaluation unit in mid-1943. His mandate was clear: acquire enemy aircraft, fly them, analyze them, and translate that knowledge into tactics that would save German lives. The unit operated from Rechlin-Lärz Airfield, a sprawling Luftwaffe test facility 90 kilometers north of Berlin. Security was absolute. The aircraft carried German markings, black crosses and swastikas painted over Allied insignia, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. A Spitfire with a swastika on its tail, a P-47 Thunderbolt with Luftwaffe codes, and now a B-17 Flying Fortress. The captured fortress arrived at Rechlin in early January 1944. Ground crews immediately began detailed technical analysis. They measured the thickness of armor plating behind pilot seats, 8 millimeters of hardened steel, enough to stop rifle-caliber rounds but vulnerable to 20 millimeters cannon shells. They disassembled the defensive gun turrets, noting the traverse speed, the ammunition capacity, the blind spots in coverage. They test-fired the 50 caliber Brownings, comparing their rate of fire and penetration to German MG-131 and MG-151 weapons, but the real value came from flying it. Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche drew the assignment. An experienced test pilot, Lerche had flown nearly every captured Allied aircraft in the Luftwaffe inventory. He'd taken a P-51 Mustang through aerobatic maneuvers, testing its roll rate and dive speed. He'd flown a Soviet Yak-9, evaluating its turning radius against a Bf-109. Now he would fly the B-17, not gently, but aggressively. He would push it through combat maneuvers, simulate battle damage, force it into situations that American crews faced every day over Germany. The first flight was routine. Lerche took the fortress up to 15,000 feet, ran through standard procedures, tested the engine performance and control response. The aircraft handled predictably, heavy but stable. It wanted to fly straight and level, exactly what a bomber needed for accurate bombing runs. But that stability became a liability in combat. The B-17 couldn't evade. It couldn't outrun fighters. It could only absorb punishment and rely on its guns. Lerche decided to test that. On subsequent flights, he brought Bf-109 and FW-190 fighters into mock combat scenarios. The fighter pilots, many of them veterans with multiple bomber kills, were instructed to attack the B-17 from various angles, while Lurch maneuvered defensively. The results were illuminating. Head-on attacks proved most effective when executed from slightly above the bomber's nose, forcing the bombardier and top turret gunner to divide their fire. Tail attacks worked only if the fighter approached from below, climbing at a steep angle to exploit the ball turret's limited depression. Beam attacks, coming in perpendicular to the bomber, exposed the fighter to the most concentrated defensive fire and were judged the most dangerous. But the real discovery came during low-angle attacks from the rear. The ball turret gunner couldn't track a fighter approaching from 6 o'clock low if the fighter stayed below a certain angle. The waist gunners, positioned inside the fuselage with limited fields of view, couldn't engage targets below the tail. And the tail gunner, isolated in his position, had restricted downward vision. A fighter that approached from directly behind and below, climbing into a firing position at the last moment, could put sustained cannon fire into the bomber's belly, hitting oxygen systems, fuel tanks, bomb bay. Before the crew could respond, German pilots began using this tactic immediately. Kill rates increased. The captured B-17 had proven its value, but someone wanted it to do more. The order came directly from the Reich Aviation's ministry. The B-17 would be flown over Berlin. The mission would be publicized in advance. Civilians would be encouraged to watch. Photographs would be taken for propaganda newspapers. The captured American bomber would be paraded above the Reich capital as proof of German air superiority. Baumbach objected. He argued that the aircraft was too valuable for propaganda flights. Its primary purpose was technical evaluation and tactical analysis. Flying it over Berlin served no intelligence purpose and risked losing the aircraft to accident or mechanical failure. More critically, he pointed out the obvious danger. German flak batteries and fighter squadrons would see a B-17 in their airspace. They were trained to shoot B-17s. No amount of advance warning could override that instinct. His objections were dismissed. The propaganda value outweighed the tactical concerns. The flight would proceed. To mitigate the risks, advance notifications would be sent to all flak batteries within 100 kilometers of Berlin. Fighter squadrons would be briefed. The B-17 would fly a predetermined route at a specific altitude, clearly marked with German insignia, escorted by Luftwaffe fighters to visually identify it as friendly. The date was set, January 1944. The exact day remains disputed in historical records, but most sources indicate mid-January, during a period of clear weather over northern Germany. Lurch would pilot the aircraft. His co-pilot would be another experienced test pilot, Oberleutnant Hans-Heinz Alterauge. A skeleton crew of German mechanics and radio operators would occupy the other positions, not to man the guns, but to monitor systems during flight. The bomber would be unarmed. The ammunition had been removed from all defensive positions. This wasn't a combat mission. It was a demonstration. The morning of the flight, Lurch conducted a standard pre-flight inspection. The B-17 had been repainted. German markings were prominent on wings and fuselage. A large swastika decorated the tail. The nose art, whatever name the American crew had painted there, had been covered over. This was a German aircraft now, at least officially, but from 2 kilometers away, at altitude, with the sun reflecting off aluminum skin, it looked exactly like every other B-17 that had bombed Germany for the past year. And that was the problem no one at the Aviation Ministry had fully considered. Advance notifications had been sent. Radio messages had been transmitted. Orders had been issued. But those orders filtered down through layers of military bureaucracy, through command structures stretched thin by years of war, through flak batteries that rotated crews every few weeks, through fighter squadrons scrambled at a moment's notice, and, in the chaos of defending a capital city under constant threat of air attack, orders could be forgotten, instincts could take over. At 10:15 a.m., the B-17 lifted off from Rechlin. 2 Bf-109 fighters flanked it, one on each wing. The formation turned south, heading directly toward Berlin, 90 kilometers away. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited. The fortress climbed to 4,000 meters, low enough to be clearly visible from the ground, high enough to provide a commanding view of the city. Lurch settled into the flight pattern. The engines droned steadily. The escorts maintained formation. Everything proceeded according to plan. Berlin appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later, and then the shooting started. The ball turret gunner couldn't track a fighter approaching from 6 o'clock low if the fighter stayed below a certain angle. The waist gunners, positioned inside the fuselage with limited fields of view, couldn't engage targets below the tail. And the tail gunner, isolated in his position, had restricted downward vision. A fighter that approached from directly behind and below, climbing into a firing position at the last moment, could put sustained cannon fire into the bomber's belly, hitting oxygen systems, fuel tanks, bomb bay. Before the crew could respond, German pilots began using this tactic immediately. Kill rates increased. The captured B-17 had proven its value, but someone wanted it to do more. The order came directly from the Luftwaffe Ministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry. The B-17 would be flown over Berlin. The mission would be publicized in advance. Civilians would be encouraged to watch. Photographs would be taken for propaganda newspapers. The captured American bomber would be paraded above the Reich capital as proof of German air superiority. Baumbach objected. He argued that the aircraft was too valuable for propaganda flights. Its primary purpose was technical evaluation and tactical analysis. Flying it over Berlin served no intelligence purpose and risked losing the aircraft to accident or mechanical failure. More critically, he pointed out the obvious danger. German flak batteries and fighter squadrons would see a B-17 in their airspace. They were trained to shoot B-17s. No amount of advance warning could override that instinct. His objections were dismissed. The propaganda value outweighed the tactical concerns. The flight would proceed. To mitigate the risks, advance notifications would be sent to all flak batteries within 100 kilometers of Berlin. Fighter squadrons would be briefed. The B-17 would fly a predetermined route at a specific altitude, clearly marked with German insignia, escorted by Luftwaffe fighters to visually identify it as friendly. The date was set. January 1944. The exact day remains disputed in historical records, but most sources indicate mid-January, during a period of clear weather over northern Germany. Lurch would pilot the aircraft. His co-pilot would be another experienced test pilot, Oberleutnant Hans-Heinz Altroge. A skeleton crew of German mechanics and radio operators would occupy the other positions, not to man the guns, but to monitor systems during flight. The bomber would be unarmed. The ammunition had been removed from all defensive positions. This wasn't a combat mission. It was a demonstration. The morning of the flight, Lurch conducted a standard pre-flight inspection. The B-17 had been repainted. German markings were prominent on wings and fuselage. A large swastika decorated the tail. The nose art, whatever name the American crew had painted there, had been covered over. This was a German aircraft now, at least officially, but from 2 kilometers away. At altitude, with the sun reflecting off aluminum skin, it looked exactly like every other B-17 that had bombed Germany for the past year. And that was the problem no one at the Aviation Ministry had fully considered. Advance notifications had been sent, radio messages had been transmitted, orders had been issued. But those orders filtered down through layers of military bureaucracy, through command structures stretched thin by years of war, through flak batteries that rotated crews every few weeks, through fighter squadrons scrambled at a moment's notice, and in the chaos of defending a capital city under constant threat of air attack, orders could be forgotten, instincts could take over. At 10:15 a.m., the B-17 lifted off from Rechlin. 2 Bf-109 fighters flanked it, one on each wing. The formation turned south, heading directly toward Berlin, 90 kilometers away. The weather was clear. Visibility unlimited. The fortress climbed to 4,000 meters, low enough to be clearly visible from the ground, high enough to provide a commanding view of the city. Lurch settled into the flight pattern. The engines droned steadily. The escorts maintained formation. Everything proceeded according to plan. Berlin appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later, and then the shooting started. Other commanders were less diligent. The orders arrived during shift changes. They were posted on bulletin boards that crews didn't always read. They were mentioned in morning briefings attended by half the battery because the other half was sleeping after night duty. Some batteries never received the orders at all. Communications failures, misrouted dispatches, units that had rotated positions in the 72 hours since the notification was sent, and some crews simply didn't believe it. A captured American bomber flying over Berlin, escorted by German fighters? It sounded like disinformation. It sounded like exactly the kind of story a clever Allied intelligence officer would plant to make German defenders hesitate during a real attack. Some battery commanders assumed the notification was a test, a drill to see if their crews would foolishly hold fire. When enemy aircraft appeared, fighter, squadrons faced a different problem the standing scramble protocol required. Immediate launch when unidentified aircraft entered the Berlin defense zone. Pilots sat in cockpits on 5-minute alert. When the alarm sounded, they didn't wait for detailed briefings. They took off, climbed to intercept altitude, and received vectors from ground controllers via radio. The identification happened in the air at closing speeds of 600 kilometers per hour, with seconds to decide, friend or foe, Jagdgeschwader 111 and 300, the fighter wings responsible for Berlin defense, had received the same notification as the flak batteries. But fighter pilots rotated constantly. Squadrons transferred between bases. New pilots arrived daily to replace casualties. The notification might reach the wing commander, but did it reach every pilot? Did it reach the pilot who happened to be on alert duty that specific morning? The Luftwaffe's solution was the escort fighters. 2 Bf-109s, one on each wing of the B-17, clearly visible, clearly German. They would provide visual identification. Any pilot or gunner who saw the formation would see the escorts and recognize the B-17 as friendly, except that tactic had been used before. By the Allies, in late 1943, Allied fighter escort tactics had evolved. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings now accompanied bomber formations deep into Germany. The fighters flew close to the bombers, weaving above and beside them, protecting them from German interceptors. German flak crews had learned to ignore the escorts and fire at the bombers. The presence of fighters near a 4-engine bomber no longer signaled friendly. It signaled a heavily defended target. The Luftwaffe's planning had accounted for technical details, but missed human factors. They had notified the batteries, but hadn't verified comprehension. They had briefed the squadrons, but hadn't ensured every pilot knew. They had designed a demonstration that required split-second recognition and perfect communication in a system strained by years of war, and they had scheduled it during daylight, when trigger discipline was at its weakest. Night raids allowed for deliberate identification. Searchlights illuminated aircraft. Ground controllers had time to vector fighters. But daylight attacks happened fast. Bombers appeared suddenly, released their loads, and disappeared. Flak crews fired on visual acquisition. Fighter pilots attacked on intercept vectors. There was no time for radio confirmation, no opportunity for second-guessing. The B-17, carrying Lurch and his crew, was flying into that environment. At 10:40 a.m., the formation crossed the outer defense perimeter. The northern suburbs of Berlin spread below. Oranienburg, Hennigsdorf, industrial districts scarred by previous bombing raids. Lurch maintained steady altitude and heading. The Bf-109 escorts held formation, 150 meters off each wingtip. The visibility was perfect. From the ground, the aircraft were clearly visible against the winter sky. A flak battery near Hennigsdorf tracked the formation. The battery commander had been briefed. He recognized the silhouette, saw the escorts, checked his watch. The timing matched the notification. He ordered his crews to hold fire and simply observe. But 3 kilometers south, another battery hadn't been briefed. The crew saw a B-17. 4 engines. American silhouette. The recognition was instant. The gun commander didn't hesitate. He barked firing orders. The crew responded with trained efficiency. Shells were loaded. The 88mm gun elevated. The crew calculated lead and altitude. At 10:43 a.m., they fired. The first shell detonated 200 meters below the B-17, slightly ahead of the formation. A black cloud of shrapnel bloomed in the clear air. Lurch saw it through the cockpit window. For a moment, he thought it was a ceremonial salvo, some elaborate addition to the demonstration he hadn't been informed about. Then the second shell exploded, 100 meters to the right. Then the third, almost dead ahead, close enough that the aircraft shuddered from the concussion. The battery was finding its range, and they weren't the only ones firing anymore. Lurka shoved the control yoke forward. The B-17 nosed down sharply, losing 200 meters in seconds. The escorts broke formation, peeling away to avoid the descending bomber. Another shell burst exactly where the fortress had been 3 seconds earlier. A killing shot if Lurch had maintained altitude. Shrapnel rattled against the aircraft's belly, punching small holes through aluminum skin, but missing anything critical. Alt-Raga was already on the radio, transmitting on the emergency frequency. His voice was controlled but urgent. Friendly aircraft taking fire. Repeat, friendly aircraft. German markings. Cease fire. Cease fire. No one was listening, or rather, everyone was listening. But in the chaos of an air defense network suddenly activated, radio discipline collapsed. Multiple batteries were now tracking the formation. Ground controllers were demanding identification. Fighter squadrons were requesting intercept vectors. The emergency frequency was flooded with overlapping transmissions, voices shouting over each other, static bursts, confused commands. Alt-Raga's message disappeared into the noise. Below, in the northern suburbs, air raid sirens began wailing. Someone had sounded the alarm. The protocol was automatic. Unidentified 4-engine aircraft over Berlin meant enemy attack. Civilians ran for shelters. Factory workers abandoned their posts. Streetcars halted. In apartment buildings and government offices, people grabbed emergency bags and headed for basements. The daily rhythm of wartime Berlin, already tense, already exhausted, shattered into panic. More flak batteries opened fire. The 3rd Flak Division, positioned around the government district, had received the notification. But the division's fire control was decentralized. Individual battery commanders retained authority to engage targets that posed immediate threats. When the air raid sirens sounded, when they saw a B-17 diving toward the city center with shells bursting around it, the engagement looked exactly like a bombing run under fire. Several commanders made the same calculation. Orders or no orders, if that bomber releases its payload over Berlin, we answer to Hitler himself. They fired. The sky filled with black bursts. The 80 mm shells detonated in patterns. Altitude fuses set for 3,800 meters, then 3,600, then 3,400, tracking the B-17's descent. Lurka was flying evasively now, shallow banks left and right, climbing 50 meters, then dropping 100, trying to break the flak battery's tracking solutions. The Fortress handled sluggishly compared to a fighter, but he was a skilled pilot. He used the bomber's weight, its momentum, translating altitude into airspeed and back again. But there were too many guns. A shell burst directly beneath the aircraft. The explosion lifted the B-17 like a toy, slamming it upward. Lurch's head hit the cockpit ceiling. Alt-Raga was thrown against his restraints. In the rear fuselage, one of the German mechanics was hurled across the compartment, dislocating his shoulder. The smell of cordite and hot metal filled the cabin. Warning lights flashed on the instrument panel. Number 2 engine was running rough. Shrapnel had damaged the cylinder heads. Oil pressure was dropping, and then the fighters arrived. 2 Fu-90s from Jagdgeschwader 11 scrambled from Doberitz airfield west of Berlin. The pilots had launched on standing alert orders when the air raid sirens activated. Ground control had given them vectors. 4-engine bomber, 3,500 meters northern approach. They had climbed through thin clouds and acquired the target visually within 3 minutes. The lead pilot saw exactly what he expected to see. A B-17 flying Fortress, diving through flak, clearly attempting to evade German defenses. The presence of 2 Bf-109s nearby registered, but the tactical picture made sense. The 109s were attacking the bomber, driving it into the flak zone. Combined arms. The pilot pushed his throttle forward and armed his weapons. 4 20mm cannons, 2 13mm machine guns. Enough firepower to dismantle a bomber in a single pass. Lurch saw them coming. He had no defensive weapons. The gun positions were unmanned, the ammunition removed. The only defense was evasion. He threw the B-17 into a hard right bank, harder than the aircraft was designed for, hard enough that metal groaned and rivets popped. The bomber wasn't built for aerobatics, but terror made anything possible. The lead FW-190 opened fire at 400 meters. Tracers arced through the space the B-17 had just vacated. The fighter pilot corrected, leading the target, squeezing the trigger again. This burst connected. Cannon shells stitched across the bomber's left wing, punching through the aluminum skin, severing control cables. One shell hit the number 1 engine nacelle and detonated inside. The engine exploded in a spray of oil and metal fragments. Fire erupted, streaming back along the wing. Lurch feathered the propeller and activated the engine fire suppression system. CO2 flooded the nacelle. The fire guttered, but didn't completely extinguish. Flames still licked around the engine cowling. The B-17 was now flying on 3 engines, one of them damaged, with a wing on fire. Over the most heavily defended city in Europe, the Bf-109 escorts finally acted. They had broken formation during the initial flak attack, climbing away to avoid the bursts. Now they dove back down, positioning themselves between the B-17 and the attacking FW-190s. One of the 109 pilots got on the radio, not the clogged emergency frequency, but the fighter squadron tactical channel. He identified himself by call sign and screamed, "Cease fire!" "Friendly aircraft?" "That is our captured B-17. "Stand down." The FW-190 pilots heard him, but they didn't believe him. Captured B-17? Flying over Berlin during an air raid? It sounded like desperation. It sounded like exactly what an enemy pilot might say if his bomber was about to be destroyed. The FW-190 lead pilot had 17 confirmed kills. He'd seen damaged bombers before, seen crews trying anything to survive. This was a trick. He repositioned for another attack. The Bf-109 escort moved to block him. The 2 German fighters, theoretically on the same side, were now maneuvering against each other at 400 kilometers per hour, 3,000 meters above Berlin. The FW-190 pilot had to make a decision: break off and lose the bomber kill, or go through his own aircraft to get it. He broke off, but other fighters were already inbound. The fighter control network had scrambled additional squadrons. Pilots from 3 different airfields were converging on the coordinates, and they were hearing the same confused radio traffic. Some voices saying friendly aircraft, others saying enemy bomber, others demanding clarification that never came. Lurch had one option left. Get out of Berlin airspace immediately. He pushed the throttles to maximum on the 3 remaining engines. The B-17 accelerated, but slowly. The drag from battle damage, the dead engine, the fire still burning on the wing, all resisted forward motion. He turned northeast, toward Rechlin, toward friendly territory. The bomber was losing altitude steadily. Number 2 engine was overheating, temperature gauges redlining. He might have to shut it down. 2 engines wouldn't keep the fortress in the air. More flak erupted ahead of him. The eastern flak belt, positioned to defend against Soviet bombers approaching from Poland, had now acquired the target. Their orders were simpler. Anything flying east out of Berlin at low altitude after an air raid alarm was either an escaping enemy bomber or a damaged German aircraft trying to reach safety. Visual identification at 3,000 meters was unreliable. Standing orders said, "If in doubt, fire." They fired. Lurch flew through a curtain of steel. Shells burst on all sides, above, below, left, right. The fortress shuddered continuously from near misses. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage, shredding hydraulic lines, severing electrical cables, puncturing fuel tanks. Gasoline began streaming from the left wing, vaporizing in the slipstream. The fire around number 1 engine suddenly intensified, fed by fresh fuel. Altroge was still on the radio, transmitting continuously now, no longer trying for proper protocol. "Friendly. German crew. Captured bomber. Stop shooting. For God's sake, stop shooting." Someone finally listened. A flak division commander east of Berlin, one who had actually read the notification, who had been waiting for the demonstration flight, recognized what was happening. He got on the primary fire control network and issued an override command. "All batteries cease fire." "Cease fire immediately." Friendly aircraft confirmed. The flak stopped. The sudden silence was almost shocking. No more shells. No more explosions. Just the roar of 3 laboring engines and the whistle of wind through hundreds of shrapnel holes. Lurch maintained his heading. The eastern suburbs fell away behind him. Open countryside appeared ahead. Forests, fields, the safety of unpopulated airspace, The fire on the wing finally died. The CO2 system, combined with the fuel starvation, had starved the flames. The engine was destroyed, but it wasn't burning. That was enough. Lurch checked his instruments. Fuel was critically low. The ruptured tanks had dumped most of their reserves. Number 2 engine was minutes from seizure. Hydraulics were failing. He was flying on manual controls now, forcing the yoke with physical strength. The landing gear system was damaged. He didn't know if the gear would extend when he needed it, but he was alive. His crew was alive, and Rechlin was 40 kilometers ahead. They made it. The landing was brutal. Gear partially extended. One strut collapsed on touchdown, the aircraft slewing sideways before grinding to a halt at the runway's edge. Fire trucks surrounded them within seconds. Lurch and his crew evacuated through the rear hatch, stumbling away from the smoking wreckage. The B-17, the prize, the intelligence asset, the propaganda trophy, was a ruin. Over 200 shrapnel holes, one engine destroyed, another damaged beyond repair. Hydraulic systems shredded, electrical systems dead, structural damage throughout the fuselage. The aircraft would never fly again. The demonstration had lasted 31 minutes from takeoff to landing. During that time, the Luftwaffe had very nearly shot down its own prize. The official report filed the next day was brief. Demonstration flight proceeded as planned. Aircraft sustained minor damage due to communication difficulties. No casualties. Mission objectives partially achieved. The reality was catastrophic. 3 German flak crews had fired over 200 shells at their own aircraft. 2 FW-190 pilots had executed attack runs, 1 scoring hits. The fighter escort had nearly engaged in combat with another German squadron. Air raid sirens had triggered a citywide panic, sending hundreds of thousands of Berlin civilians into shelters for a non-existent attack. Industrial production had halted for 40 minutes. And the captured B-17, the aircraft that represented months of intelligence work, technical analysis, and tactical advantage, was wrecked beyond economical repair. The propaganda photographs were never published. The newsreel footage was never released. The demonstration that was supposed to prove German air superiority had instead exposed a crippling coordination failure. The postmortem began. Immediately, Luftwaffe investigators interviewed flak battery commanders, fighter pilots, ground controllers, and radio operators. The findings were damning. Of 47 heavy flak batteries in the Berlin defense zone, only 23 had received clear briefings about the demonstration flight. Of those 23, only 11 had successfully communicated the information to all crew shifts. Among fighter squadrons, the notification had reached wing commanders but failed to propagate to individual pilots on alert duty. The radio network, overwhelmed by simultaneous transmissions during the incident, had proven incapable of resolving the identification crisis in real time. But the deeper problem was cultural. German air defense doctrine in 1944 prioritized speed over verification. Flak crews were trained to fire first and identify later because Allied bombing raids didn't allow time for deliberation. Every second of hesitation meant bombs on target. Fighter pilots operated under similar pressure. Close with the enemy quickly, attack decisively, disengage before escort fighters respond. The entire system was optimized for instant reaction against a known threat. Allied bombers, introducing a friendly aircraft with an enemy silhouette into that system, was like throwing a switch in reverse and expecting machinery to change direction instantaneously. It couldn't. The muscle memory, the trained reflexes, the survival instincts developed over hundreds of combat missions, all of it overrode written orders and radio messages. When flak crews saw a B-17, they fired. When fighter pilots acquired a 4-engine bomber, they attacked. The cognitive dissonance between "that's a B-17" and "that's friendly" simply couldn't be resolved in the seconds available. Werner Baumbach had predicted this. His objections before the flight had been precise and prophetic. But he'd been overruled by officers who understood propaganda better than air combat operations. The price was nearly the lives of a German crew and the destruction of an irreplaceable intelligence asset. The incident was classified immediately. Details were restricted to senior Luftwaffe commanders and a small circle of staff officers. The crews involved were instructed not to discuss what had happened. Official records were sanitized or destroyed. For decades after the war, historians had only fragmentary evidence that the flight had occurred at all, but the lessons learned, the ones that mattered operationally, were distributed throughout the Luftwaffe air defense. Network new protocols were implemented. Friendly aircraft flying unusual profiles would no longer rely solely on written notifications. Radio broadcasts would begin 30 minutes before the aircraft entered defended airspace, transmitted continuously on multiple frequencies. Visual signals would be standardized, flares in specific color sequences that no Allied aircraft could replicate. Escort fighters would be doubled, with explicit orders to aggressively block any intercepts. And most critically, demonstration flights over heavily defended areas were prohibited. The intelligence value of captured aircraft was too high to risk for morale purposes. The captured B-17 itself was salvaged for parts. The intact sections of fuselage were used for continued defensive armament studies. The undamaged engines were tested to failure, measuring performance characteristics under stress. The wreckage yielded data for months, but the aircraft would never fly again. Hauptmann Lursche survived the war. He continued as a test pilot, flying captured Allied aircraft until Germany's collapse in 1945. In post-war interviews, he spoke carefully about the Berlin incident, acknowledging the flight but declining to detail the friendly fire. It wasn't until the 1980s, when Luftwaffe records were declassified, that the full scope of the disaster became public. The broader strategic lesson was one the Luftwaffe never fully absorbed. Air defense requires more than weapons and training. It requires communication, coordination, and the ability to process complex information under pressure. By 1944, the German air defense network was stretched beyond its capacity. Too many aircraft to track, too many raids to defend against, too many improvised solutions to cascading failures. The system worked when faced with predictable threats. It collapsed when confronted with anything unusual. The Allies exploited this weakness repeatedly in 1944 and 1945. They used captured German aircraft for reconnaissance missions, knowing German defenders would hesitate. They employed electronic warfare to jam radar and radio frequencies, creating exactly the kind of communication chaos that had nearly killed Lurch. They varied their approach routes, altitudes, and formations to force German defenders into split-second decisions where mistakes were inevitable, and they won. The captured B-17 incident was a microcosm of the larger war in the air over Europe. Technical superiority mattered, intelligence mattered, but coordination, the ability to process information, communicate clearly, and adapt to changing circumstances, mattered more. The Luftwaffe had excellent aircraft, skilled pilots, and powerful weapons. What it lacked, increasingly, was the organizational coherence to use them effectively. 31 minutes over Berlin proved that. A demonstration meant to showcase German strength instead revealed fragility. An aircraft captured as a trophy became a warning about overconfidence, and a propaganda stunt designed to boost morale taught a lesson that no Luftwaffe commander wanted to learn. By 1944, the German air defense network was reacting, not controlling. Responding to threats, not dominating airspace. Surviving, not winning. The B-17 that fell into German hands in December 1943 should have been an intelligence windfall. It was. German pilots learned its weaknesses, refined their tactics, and used that knowledge to shoot down hundreds of Allied bombers in the months that followed. Those lessons saved German lives and delayed the Allied strategic bombing campaign, but the decision to fly it over Berlin, to treat a captured weapon as a theatrical prop, wasted the asset and exposed systemic failures that Germany could not repair. The incident was a turning point not in any single battle, but in understanding. It demonstrated that the war in the air had moved beyond individual skill or tactical innovation. Victory required infrastructure, communication, and coordination on a scale that Germany in 1944 could no longer sustain. The wreckage of that B-17, scattered across Rechlin airfield after its final flight, symbolized something larger than one damaged bomber. It represented the gap between what German commanders wanted to believe about their air defenses and what those defenses could actually achieve under stress. The gap was fatal, and it was widening every day.